Orla Riverbend rose before first light, as her mother had risen before her, and her grandmother before her mother, and laid one quiet hand on the cold iron of the door-latch of the toll-post and listened for the river. The river was where it should be. She heard the slow, soft rush of it past the south landing, and the small, uneven tap of small river waves against the landing stones. And she heard the link-clink of the iron crossing chain settling against the bollards of the scow as the night current pulled at it the way the night current always pulled at it. And she heard Iska's quiet breath under the bench at her left side, slow and even and warm. That was the river. That was the morning. That was the keep right. She knelt at the small, open hearth and brought the night's banked coals up out of the white ash with the iron tongs and laid 2 split willow stick on them, and blew once. The small, clean flame stood up. The flat hearthstone at the side of the hearth had been warm all night. She set the round of barley dough onto it with the wooden bread paddle, and the small dry hiss of the dough rose into the room with the warm yeast smell of the small barley crossing. Bread baking. Then she rose. She took down her heavy, ankle-length kirtle of undyed river wool from the peg by the door and pulled it over her long linen underkirtle, and she belted it with the wide, tar-stiffened leather belt at which hung the long iron crossing key of the chain lock. The key was heavy and smooth in the way that only iron handled by 3 generations of one family becomes smooth. She tied her thick, single mahogany brown plait at the tail with a fresh strip of rivergrass cord, soaked in tar. She pulled on the heavy, oiled leather river boots laced to the calf, and the small iron cleats in the soles knocked once against the stone-flagged floor. The crossing bread had been baked on this hearthstone every dawn for 200 winters. The small, flat barley round given to every traveler in trade for the toll coin, and there was no day on which the ferry keeper at the Norra Crossing did not bake it. She turned the rounds one by one with the bread paddle, set them on the long oak trestle table along the south wall under the clean linen cloth, banked the fire, knotted her wool headcloth at the nape, and opened the door of the toll post. The river mist was on the meadow. It lay long and low and pale silver gray along the slow water of the Norra and along the meadow of pale river grass between the toll post and the landing. The first gray light of the morning was just touching the underside of the mist from the east, the mist beginning to take a faint warm tone where the light touched it. But the river itself was still dark and slow and silver gray under the mist. She breathed once, slow, and the cold mist came up under her chin and was good. Iska came out of the door at her left side without sound and stood at her hip and lifted her warm, earth-brown muzzle once into the mist. Iska's coat was dark across the spine and rust cinnamon at the shoulder and pale cream at the throat and chest and belly. Her warm golden amber eyes were on the south landing and on the line of the far bank where the river road came down out of the birch-wood. Iska had heard something Orla had not heard. Iska heard everything before Orla did. Orla laid her left hand along the crown of Iska's head and said nothing, and Iska did not turn her head. She walked down the 30 paces from the toll post to the upper edge of the landing. The stone-flagged path had been laid by her grandmother's grandfather, and the stones were worn smooth at the center where 200 winters of feet had walked them. She passed the stone mounting block at the upper edge of the landing and the small open shelter where the river folk waited out of the weather. And she walked out across the wide, flat-sloping platform of fitted river stone running 30 paces down to the water. The scow lay against the landing where she had tied it at last dusk. It was a heavy, flat-bottomed oak scow, 40 feet long and 14 wide, the planks tarred and retarred 100 times to a deep, matte black, the low railing of oak posts and tarred rope along both long sides, standing chest-high to her, the stout oak bollards at each end through which the iron crossing chain ran sitting low and dark and wet with the river mist. The iron ratchet windlass at the south end of the scow was wound to its half-turn, the long wooden hand crank standing up out of it like a small mast. The 2 ironshod ashwood poles stood in the pole clamps at the north end, the full 18-foot pole that had been her grandmother's and was now hers, and the half-length apprentice pole that had been her mother's and would be Patar's now, if the king saw what she hoped the king would see. She stepped down off the upper landing onto the scow, and the wet planks gave a single soft creak under her boots and went still. She stood at the center of the scow for the length of one slow breath, the way her mother had taught her, and felt the slow, soft pull of the night current under her feet through the planks, and the slight slack of the iron crossing chain through the bollards, and the steady weight of the scow on the dark, slow water. The scow was true. The chain was true. The river was where it should be. She walked the length of the scow and touched each of the 4 bollards with the flat of her palm as her grandmother had touched them, and each was cold and wet and solid. She turned the iron ratchet windlass once on its short loose endplay. She lifted the full iron-shod ashwood pole out of its pole clamp and stood it upright on the planks beside her. The pole was 18 feet long, and it had been her grandmother Iseult's for 50 winters, her mother Bryn's for 12, and hers for 10. The wood of the shaft was the color of dark wet honey from 140 winters of river water and tar, and there were small, pale, worn places where her grandmother's right hand had gripped, and a hand's breadth higher where her mother's had gripped, and a little higher still where her own gripped now. She set it back into the pole clamp without sound. She walked back to the great anchor stone of the chain. The south anchor stone stood at the lower edge of the landing where the fitted river stone met the dark, slow water. A single squared block of dark gray river granite the size of a small ox, set deep into the bank by the men her grandmother's grandfather had paid out of the king's first Writ coin 240 winters ago. The iron crossing chain came up out of the river at the inside face of the anchor stone, ran one full turn around the stone through the iron staple ring, and went down again into the stone-set chain lock at the riverside face. The chain lock had been turned at last dusk by Orla's hand, and now must be turned again at first light by Orla's hand, and that was the keep. She knelt at the south anchor stone, with the long iron crossing key in her right hand, and she fitted it into the keyhole, and she turned it once to the right. The bolt of the lock slid back with a small, clean iron clack that was the same iron clack her grandmother and her mother had made before her, and the chain settled half a hand's breadth into the water as the night tension came off, and she heard the slow, soft rush of the slack chain in the slow water under the scow, and she heard Iska's quiet breath at her left side, and she heard the small, uneven tap of the small river waves against the landing stones below her knee, and she heard nothing else. The crossing was open. She rose. She slid the long iron crossing key back through the leather loop on her belt. The mist was still long and low across the river, the far bank no more than a paler line in the silver gray, but the first faint, warm gold was beginning to show along the upper edge of the silver gray, and she watched, and she waited. On the upper plank of the scow's railing on the upstream side, just above the windlass, was a long row of small chalk-mark notches cut shallow into the wood. One notch for each crossing in her keep right. Below them, in fainter, older rows darkened with tar and weather, were her mother's notches, and below those her grandmother's. She had cut her first notch at 14 winters, the morning after her mother's burial, and one every crossing since. The count had stood at 14,408 at last dusk. She would cut the next at the close of the day's first crossing. She straightened. She heard then what Iska had heard. It was not loud. It was the steady muffled sound of many shod hooves on the soft earth of the river road on the far bank, and behind them the slower dragon creak of 2 wagon axles, and behind that the low murmur of men's voices that did not quite carry across the water, but was there. The river mist was lifting now along the far bank, the warm gold beginning to find the underside, and Orla saw the pale, faint shape of the river road begin to come clear out of the silver gray. And on the road, coming down out of the birch-wood toward the south landing, was a column. She counted by long habit, 12 riders in close formation, 2 wagons behind, a pair of pack mules at the rear. The riders wore long cloaks the dark color of forest green wool, and one of them, the rider third from the front, riding a tall, dark gray gelding, wore a cloak of darker plum-purple, and rode with the unmistakable straight back of a queen mother. The rider at the head of the column wore the same dark forest green wool, and at his right shoulder, where the cloak was fastened, the small, pale glint of bronze caught the first low gold of the morning. A bronze ferry-scow pin, the bracken seal. Orla stood at the upper edge of the landing with her hand on the cold, wet top of the south anchor stone, and did not move and did not breathe for the length of 3 slow breaths. She knew then. She had known in some way since the first hard knot in her belly when she had risen at the second watch of the night and could not lie still. She had known since Iska had been at the door before she had been at the door. She had known, perhaps, since she was a girl of 7 winters, and her grandmother Iseult had stood with her at the same anchor stone on a summer dawn and pointed across the water and said, "When the dark forest green and the dark plum-purple come down that road together, daughter, the king is on the river road, and the river road has come for the keep." She heard the soft, fast pad of bare feet running down the meadow path from the upstream willow cottage and turned her head. Pater Threshford came out of the river mist at a hard run, his bare feet slapping the wet stone, his short, undyed gray-brown wool tunic flapping at the knee, his thick, dark brown hair falling forward into his eyes, his pale river-gray eyes wide. He stopped at the upper edge of the landing, 4 paces from her, breathing hard. The small iron-shod half-pole he had cut for himself last summer carried over his right shoulder. "Mistress Orla," he said. He swallowed. "Grandfather sends word. He has been awake since the 2nd watch. He says the dark forest green and the dark plum-purple are on the river road, and he is coming down the willow path now with the bundle." "I see them, Petar," she said. Her voice was low and quiet and very steady. She did not turn her head from the column on the far bank. "He says," Petar said, breathing still, "he says it is the king." "I know it is the king, Petar," she said. Petar looked across the water at the column. He saw the bronze ferry-scow pin. His pale river-gray eyes went wider still. He set his half-pole down quietly along the rail of the scow and did not speak. Orla laid her left hand on the top of the south anchor stone, where the wet iron of the chain came up out of the river, and she set her right hand on the warm, tarred wood of her grandmother's pole, standing in the pole clamp at the north end of the scow, and she stood between the two of them in the lifting river mist, the king's column coming down the river road on the far bank, Iska at her hip, Petar at her right shoulder, the slow, soft rush of the Norra under her feet, and she waited. The mist lifted from the water, slow and bright, gold at the upper edge. The first sun struck the south landing. The bronze ferry-scow pin at the lead rider's shoulder went bright. The Norra Crossing was open. The Reeve came down out of the upstream meadow on his slow gray gelding before the king's column had reached the south landing. He came down out of the willow scrub at the upper bend of the meadow path with the public toll ledger held tight under his left arm and the brass toll officer's buckle at his belt catching the first low gold. He had ridden hard from his cousin's house at Marsk's Bend before the 2nd watch. The slow gray gelding's flanks were steaming, his pale watery blue eyes red at the rims with cold and want of sleep, the iron-gray hair oiled back from the high, pale forehead, the thin, pointed, iron-gray beard combed smooth, the pale gray wool stockings spattered to the knee with road mud. He saw Orla at the south anchor stone, Petar at her right shoulder, Iska at her left hip with the warm, earth-brown ears flat and the warm, golden amber eyes on him, and the king's column on the far bank moving slow toward the south landing. He swung down from the gelding and let the reins fall over its neck. "Mistress Riverbend," he said. His high, reedy nasal voice carried thin and uneven across the meadow. An early rising on a great morning, mistress." Orla turned her head. She did not move from the south anchor stone. She did not take her left hand from the cold, wet top of the stone. She did not take her right hand from the warm, tarred wood of her grandmother's pole. "Reeve, Marsk," she said. The Reeve came forward across the whetstone of the upper landing in his small, careful steps in the low black leather shoes with the brass buckles. He did not look at the king's column on the far bank. He kept his pale, watery blue eyes on Orla's hand on the south anchor stone and on the long iron crossing key hanging from the leather loop on her belt and on the warm, tarred wood of the pole and on Iska's flat ears. "A great morning," he said again. The small, dry chuckle came at the end. "The king himself on the river road before the 2nd bell. Not in living memory, mistress. Even your grandmother, the late great King Aaron, came down only the once in his 51 winters of the throne. The flood winter, the famous flood winter." "He came down the once," Orla said. "He came back across the river the once. My grandmother pulled him." "Just so, mistress," the small, dry chuckle. "And here we are, mistress, a young king, full of the blood of his late grandfather, riding down to the river road to see the Norra Crossing for the first time in his reign. We must not embarrass our king, mistress, with small confusions of the toll ledger, with small disagreements of count. It is the very time of all times to be quite certain that the public toll ledger and the keeper's mark agree, completely, for the king." He shifted the public toll ledger out from under his left arm and held it across the front of his plum-purple tunic with both hands and bowed an inch over it. "I have brought the toll ledger to the toll post," he said. The small, dry chuckle. "As is my office, mistress. To agree the count for the day, as is my office." Orla took her left hand from the cold, wet top of the south anchor stone. She took her right hand from the warm, tarred wood of her grandmother's pole. She did not look at the Reeve. She looked once at the king's column on the far bank, which had reached the upper edge of the south landing now and was halting at the river road's edge to wait for the river mist to lift the rest of the way off the water before coming on. She looked once at Petar, who stood very still at her right shoulder, with his pale river-gray eyes on the Reeve and his half-pole still laid quiet along the rail. She looked once at Iska, whose flat ears had not lifted. "Petar." "Yes, mistress." "Stand at the upper landing. Watch the column on the far bank. Ring the ferry-bell once if a rider sets foot on the south landing stones. Ring it twice if a wagon does. Ring it 3 times for the king." "Yes, mistress." "Do not leave the upper landing." "No, mistress." She turned and walked the 30 paces back up the stone-flagged path from the south anchor stone to the toll post. The Reeve fell in behind her. Iska walked at her left hip without sound. She opened the door and stepped through. The toll post was warm with the banked hearth and the warm yeast smell of the small barley crossing breads. She stepped to the inside and stood with her back to the south wall and her hand on the bench edge of the long oak trestle bench. He came through. He set the public toll ledger down on the stone shelf beside the hearth, the red-stained calfskin worn smooth at the brass corners. He opened it to the page for the present winter, laid the inkhorn at the top, and laid one of his 3 quills beside it. He turned his small, close-set, pale, watery blue eyes from the ledger to Orla. "Mistress," the small, dry chuckle. "We must agree the day's rate, mistress, as is the office." "What rate, Reeve?" "The half rate, mistress." Small, dry chuckle. "As we have agreed every market day for 10 winters, mistress. The half rate, the half tally. 1 silver of every 2 silver paid into your good hand, mistress, on the public ledger, and the—" small, dry chuckle. "And the matter of the other silver, mistress, settles itself privately, between gentle people, as it has always settled." "There is a king on the river road, Reeve." "There is, mistress." "There is a king at the south landing." "There is, mistress." "And the day's rate of the king's own first morning at the Norra Crossing is to be the half rate." "It must be, mistress." The small, dry chuckle. He shifted his weight from his left, low, black leather shoe to his right. "It must be the half rate, mistress, you understand. There can be no confusion of the count, mistress. On the very morning the king comes down, the young king is full of the blood of his late grandfather, mistress, full of the blood, and a confusion of the count on this morning would be most regrettable indeed for the late great King Aaron's good name, and most regrettable for the late great King Aldred's good name, and most regrettable, mistress, for the keep right of the Riverbend line, which has held this crossing for 240 winters." He paused. He let the words sit. He drew the small, dry chuckle out a little longer than he had drawn the others. "Mistress?" His pale, watery blue eyes went a little smaller. "I will speak quite plain, this once. If there is one word from your good hand to the king of any tally other than the public ledger, it will be the last word your good hand sets at this crossing. The keep right of the Riverbend line will be broken. My cousin's wife at Marsk's Bend will hold the chain key by dusk tomorrow. The great Norra Crossing will pass to the Marsks. Your grandmother's pole will be set down. Your mother's mark will be cut from the rail. The river folk of the South Road who cannot pay the wagon rate at Marsk's Bend will not cross at all." He stopped. "It is your choice, mistress." The small, dry chuckle. "It is your choice." Orla stood with her back to the south wall and her right hand on the edge of the long oak trestle bench, and she did not move. She did not move her hand. She did not move her shoulders. She did not move the line of her mouth. She looked at the Reeve from her warm, hazel-green eyes, the way her grandmother had looked at the late King Aldred in the Keep Right hearing 12 winters ago, when the late King Aldred had asked her, in his quiet, tired way, whether the Norra Crossing was well kept. The look was steady and direct and held no anger in it that the Reeve could read, and the Reeve could not read it. "The half-rate, Reeve," she said. "Just so, mistress." The small, dry chuckle came again. He let his shoulders ease a hand's breadth. "Just so." "And the day's silver?" "As always, mistress. The day's silver, into your good hand at last bell, by my own hand at the toll-post stone shelf, in the manner of all our market days." "As always." "As always, mistress." He bent over the public toll ledger and dipped the quill in the inkhorn and wrote the day's date in his small, slanted brown ink hand at the head of the page. He wrote the half rate at the right margin. He capped the inkhorn. He laid the quill beside it. He bowed to her an inch. "I will wait at the upper meadow," he said. "I will go up to greet the king at the upper edge of the meadow when he crosses, mistress, as is the office of the royal ford steward." As is the office, Reeve. He bowed again, the same inch. The small, dry chuckle came once more. He gathered the public toll ledger from the stone shelf, set it under his left arm, and went out of the toll post door without closing it behind him. The door swung an inch in the river wind and stayed. Orla did not move from the bench edge for the length of 5 slow breaths. She let the breath go out long. She let the next come in slow. She set her right hand once flat against the warm wood of the trestle table beside the breadcloth, and felt the warm wood and the warm yeast smell of the small barley crossing breads under the linen cloth came up around her hand, and she let it settle her. Iska came up from the corner where she had laid herself the moment the Reeve had stepped through the door, and stood at Orla's left hip, and lifted her warm earth-brown muzzle once toward Orla's hand on the table. And Orla laid her hand on the warm crown of the wolf's head, and felt the warm, flat, firm bone of the skull under the warm pelt, and she breathed once more, slow, and stood straight. "He has gone to the meadow," she said, low, to Iska. "Now Cosmin will come." She heard the sound at the upstream willow path then. The slow, steady, soft footfall of a tall, stooped old man in heavy, oiled leather river boots, coming down the willow path from the upstream cottage, slow and unhurried, and a little stooped under a long bundle on his back. She went to the open door and stood in the doorway and looked up the willow path. Old Cosmin Threshford came out of the willow scrub at the upper bend of the path, 20 paces above the toll post, slow and tall and a little stooped, his long, pure white hair loose to his shoulders, his long, pure white beard forked and clean against the dark gray-brown of his river wool kirtle, his deep brow creases set in the calm, steady pattern they always set in, his pale river-gray eyes very clear in the morning light. On his back he carried a long bundle wrapped in tarred linen, the color of dark wet plank, half a man's height long, tied at 3 places with thin tarred cord. At his belt, coiled twice and tied off neatly, was a long single tarred cord knot rope, the 10th winter's rope, not yet rolled. Peter's young cousin Maris walked at his right side, carrying his elbow lightly, and beyond the willow scrub, Orla could see the small gray shape of Cosmin's tame heron stepping slow along the cottage path with him. He saw her at the toll post door, and he raised his right hand once, slow, and let it down again, and he came on down the path without speaking. Orla stepped out of the doorway. She crossed to the upstream side of the toll post and opened the small side door of the grain shed, the one that did not open onto the meadow. Cosmin came on slow down the path and turned aside 3 paces from the meadow edge and came up to the side door of the grain shed without crossing the meadow itself. The Reeve had gone forward to the upper edge of the meadow to wait for the king and was facing the river road with his back to the toll post. Cosmin came into the grain shed without sound. Maris followed. Cosmin set his right knee down once on the dry rush mat floor and slid the long bundle off his back and set it across the dry beam under the grain shelf. He laid one slow, careful hand along the length of the tarred linen and gave a single small nod. He took the 10th rope from his belt and laid it beside the bundle. He looked at Orla once with his pale, river-gray eyes. 10 winters, mistress, he said. The voice was low and slow and held no haste. 9 rolled, the 10th at my belt. The river folk are named, everyone. Their thumbprints are on the ropes beside their own knots. I have walked them at first light to be ready by high noon if your king will hear them. He will hear them, Master Threshford. Aye, mistress. He nodded once. He looked then through the side door across the meadow at the upper edge of the river road on the far bank. The king's column had begun to come down to the south landing now, the river mist lifting off the water before them like a slow gray curtain, the bronze ferry-scow pin on the lead rider's shoulder bright in the warm gold. Cosmin did not move. He stood in the open side door of the grain shed with his right hand on the doorpost, very still, his pale river-gray eyes on the lead rider's bronze ferry-scow pin. 68 winters, he said, very low to himself or to no one. 68 winters, and I have not seen the dark plum-purple come down that road but the once. And here we are, mistress, and here we are. Iska came from inside the toll post and stood at Orla's left hip and lifted her muzzle once toward Cosmin's hand on the doorpost, and Cosmin lowered his hand slow and laid it on the warm crown of the wolf's head once, light, and lifted it again. The river mist on the water lifted clean off. The king's column came on down the south landing stones. Petter at the upper landing took the small carved oak ferry bell from the hook beside the door and rang it 3 times, slow and clean, across the water. Orla took the long iron crossing key from the leather loop on her belt and turned it once at the chain lock at the south anchor stone, and the chain lock slid the bolt across and held. She did not turn the key the second turn that opened the chain to its day slack. The chain stood at its half tension, the way her grandmother had set it when a king first came down the river road. The scow lay at the upper landing, dark and still, on the dark, slow water, and waited. She walked back down the upper landing to the foot of the toll-post path. Petter Threshford stood at the upper edge of the landing with the small carved oak ferry-bell now back on the hook beside the door of the toll-post and his half-pole at his shoulder, his pale river-gray eyes very bright, his bare feet steady on the wet stone. "Petter." "Yes, mistress." "Take your half-pole, stand at the bow of the scow. We will pole across to the south landing. The king's column will board, and we will pole back. You will mind the chain windlass with one hand and the half-pole with the other. You will not speak unless I speak first." "Yes, mistress." She glanced toward the open side door of the grain shed, where Cosman Threshford stood with his right hand on the doorpost. Cosman had heard her words to Peter without their being raised. He nodded once, slow, and laid his right hand for a moment on the warm crown of Iska's head, and nodded a second time. He would mind the bundle and the meadow and Iska while Orla was on the water. Orla stepped down off the upper landing onto the scow. Petter followed at her shoulder. She walked to the south end and laid her hands on the iron ratchet windlass and turned the crank one slow turn. The chain came tight against the bollards. The scow drew loose from its tie and floated free. She turned the crank a second time, and the scow began to move along the chain southward, slow and steady. The clink of the chain through the iron staples quiet across the water. She did not look back at the toll post. She did not look at the upper meadow, where Reeve Caldermarsk stood now with his public toll ledger pressed flat across the front of his plum-purple tunic, watching the scow go out across the water with his small, close-set, pale, watery blue eyes very narrow. She set her right hand on the warm, tarred wood of her grandmother's pole standing in the pole clamp at the north end and let it stand. She did not need the pole on the long mid-river crossing. The chain held the scow true. She needed only the windlass and her hands. The river mist had lifted clean off the water. The first warm gold of the morning lay long and low across the slow gray-green of the Norra. The south landing stones stood pale in the warm light. Above the landing, on the river road that came down out of the southern birch-wood, the king's column waited. 12 riders, 2 wagons, 2 pack mules in close order. The bronze ferry-scow pin at the lead rider's shoulder held the warm gold steady. At his left hip walked a great pale silver-gray wolf with a frost-white face, watching the scow come on across the water. Orla turned the windlass crank slow and steady. Petar at the bow held the half-pole quiet across his front. When the scow was 10 paces out, she set the windlass into its locking pawl, took her grandmother's pole down from the pole clamp, and set the iron pole shoe to the river bottom. The bottom bit clean. She set her right shoulder to the pole and walked the 4 slow paces from bow to stern that brought the scow gentle against the south landing stones with the soft, small knock that meant the landing was true. She looked up. Captain Joran Arnvalt of the King's River Riders stood at the upper edge of the south landing, 5 paces from the scow. The polished steel half-helm was set under his left arm. The dark forest green riding cloak was open at the shoulder, and the captain's silver pin, a ferry-scow with 1 star above, caught the warm gold. His pale flint-gray eyes met hers at the same level across the 5 paces. "Mistress Riverbend?" His voice was low and clipped and unhurried. "The king will cross." "Captain Arnvalt." Her voice was as low and as quiet. "The king will cross. 8 riders, please, no more, this first crossing. The wagons may stay on the south landing until the second bell of the morning tomorrow. The pack mules may stand under the south traveler's shelter. 8 riders, no wagons, no mules. So." The captain inclined his head an inch. He turned to the column and said one short word, and the column moved in good order. 8 riders dismounted and led their tall, well-groomed, bracken-bred horses down the landing stones to the scow. The horses came on slow and well-handled, the way only horses very used to a chain ferry come on, and took their places along the rails 4 to a side, the riders standing at their heads. The Lady Marisol Aldred's daughter came down off her tall, dark gray gelding with the captain's hand offered at her elbow. Her dark plum-purple cloak fell straight from her shoulders to her ankles. The half-silvered auburn red of her two heavy braids pinned in a low crown at the nape was very calm under the dark plum-purple velvet band across her brow. She walked the length of the scow to the bow, without taking the captain's elbow, and stood at the bow rail with her back very straight and said nothing. The king came last. He came down off his tall, dark bay stallion at the upper edge of the south landing alone, without the captain's hand and without any rider's hand, the long-bodied, pale silver-gray wolf Rune at his left hip a single pace behind. He walked the landing stones to the scow at his own pace, neither hurried nor slow, the dark forest-green riding cloak falling clean from the bronze ferry-scow pin at his shoulder, and at the upper edge of the scow he stopped. He looked at Orla across 2 paces of warm, tarred wood. He stood at the upper edge of the scow, on the river stone of the south landing. She stood at the stern of the scow, with her right hand on her grandmother's pole. The level plank line of the scow's deck and the level stone line of the south landing met at a single height in the warm gold. Their eyes met at the same level. He was a tall man, and she was a tall woman, and there was no half-inch of advantage on either side. Rune at the king's left hip was very still. Iska on the upper landing across the water at the toll-post path was very still. The captain at the upper edge of the south landing held his polished steel half-helm under his left arm and said nothing. The king looked at her. She looked at the king. He stepped down onto the scow. The plank under his boot gave a single soft creak and went still. He walked the 4 slow paces to the bow rail and stood beside his mother and laid his right hand on the bow rail beside hers. Rune walked at his left hip and lay down beside the rail. The king did not speak across the water. Orla slipped the locking pawl out and turned the crank slow and steady. The scow began to move along the chain northward, the river mist rising again, pale silver-gray around the scow as the morning warmed against the cool night water. The king did not look at the toll post on the north bank as the scow came on. He looked down at the slow water passing the bow. The thin braided river-grass cord at his right wrist showed for one moment in the warm gold, and on it, the small round glint of plain copper of the crossing token of his grandfather King Aaron set close to the skin. When the scow came in to the upper landing, the link-clink of the chain went quiet. Orla set the locking pawl, set the pole shoe to the river bottom, and walked the scow gentle against the upper landing stones with the soft, small knock that meant the landing was true. The 8 riders led their horses one by one off the scow up the landing stones to the upper meadow. The captain offered his elbow to the queen mother, and she took it for 2 steps and let it go, and walked across the upper landing herself with her dark plum-purple cloak straight at her shoulders, and stopped at the stone mounting block at the upper edge of the landing. The king stepped off the scow last. He stepped off onto the river stone of the upper landing and stood for the length of one slow breath and looked once down the long meadow path to the toll post and once up the meadow to the upper edge where Reeve Calder-Marsk stood with the public toll ledger pressed flat across the front of his plum-purple tunic, the small dry chuckle on his lips ready to come, the small careful bow ready to begin. The king's storm-gray eyes rested on the Reeve for the length of one slow breath. The king did not nod. He walked past the Reeve without one word and without one nod. The small dry chuckle did not come. The small careful bow stopped half begun. The Reeve's small close-set pale watery blue eyes went a hand's breadth narrower, and the public toll ledger trembled the once against the front of the plum-purple tunic and went still. The king walked the 30 paces alone down the stone-flagged path from the stone mounting block at the upper landing to the door of the toll post. Rune walked at his left hip. The river mist rose around them, slow and pale silver-gray. Orla had come up the path ahead of him and stood inside the open door of the toll post on the inside edge of the threshold stone, a single broad slab of pale river granite worn smooth at the center, the same height as everything in the keep right of the Norra Crossing. Iska lay on the wet meadow grass a pole-length back on the upstream side of the path. Rune slowed at the king's left hip, looked once at Iska, walked 3 slow paces past the path, and lay down on the wet meadow grass a pole-length back on the downstream side. The 2 wolves lay at level height, a pole-length apart, and looked at each other across the path between them and did not move. The king came to the threshold stone. He stopped on the outside edge. Orla stood on the inside edge. His boot toes were 1 hand's breadth from her boot toes. The level plank line of the threshold stone met under both of them at a single height. His storm-gray eyes met her warm, hazel-green eyes at the same level. He was a tall man with pale, wheat-fair, sun-touched skin and dark, auburn-red, short-cropped, warrior-cut hair, and she was a tall woman with warm, sun-bronzed, honey-tanned skin and a dark mahogany-brown, thick single plait. and there was no half-inch of advantage on either side. The first warm gold of the late morning came over the upper edge of the toll-post roof from the east and lit them both. He spoke. "My grandfather, King Aaron, came to the Norra Crossing once," he said. His voice was low and even and unhurried. "In the flood winter of his 17th year, before he was crowned, your grandmother, Orla Riverbend, was the only ferry keeper on the Norra who would set out. She poled him across at noon and back at dusk. He carried her token home and never took it off. He laid it in my hand on the night he died, when I was 8 winters old, with 3 charges that were the keep right of his line." She spoke. "My grandmother, Isat, poled him across at noon and back at dusk, sire. She told me of him once when I was 7 winters old, on a summer morning at the South Anchor Stone. She gave him back his crossing token at the South Landing because the crossing was true and the token was his. She told me that no man with a ledger may stand between the throne and the ferry keeper, and that the silver passes hand to hand, or it does not pass." He looked at her for the length of 3 slow breaths. He nodded once, slow. "Mistress Riverbend." He drew breath. "Will you show me the public toll ledger?" "I will, sire." He stepped over the threshold stone into the toll post. She stepped back 1 pace from the threshold stone and let him in. The captain came to the open door a pace behind the king and stopped on the outside edge of the threshold stone with his polished steel half-helm under his left arm. And the queen mother came to the open door behind the captain and stopped on the inside edge of the threshold stone, and they did not come further. The Reeve was not at the door. The king crossed the stone-flagged floor to the small open hearth in the center of the room and stood beside the long oak trestle bench along the south wall and looked down at the public toll ledger that the Reeve had set on the stone shelf beside the hearth at first light and not yet taken back from it. The ledger was bound in red-stained calfskin with brass corners and the small brass clasp on the long side. He laid his left hand once flat along the cover. He opened it. He read 3 pages, slow and careful in the warm gold. He did not speak. He turned back 2 pages to the page Reeve had written the day's date, and the half-rate at the head of, in the small, slanted brown ink hand. He read that page once. He closed the ledger. He set his right hand once flat on the cover. He turned to Orla. He stood at the level of the trestle bench. She stood at the level of the threshold stone. The hearth lay between them. "Mistress Riverbend." His voice was very low. "If a true tally were to be set against this public ledger tomorrow at high noon, with the Reeve at the door and the captain at the bench, and the river folk who paid in silver called by name to the toll post door, would there be one to set against it?" "There would be, sire," Orla said. He nodded once. "Tomorrow at high noon," he said, "at this toll post, at the long oak trestle bench, with the Reeve at the door, with the captain at the bench, with the river folk who paid in silver called by name, set the true tally." "I will, sire. My mother will set King Aaron's writ at the bench beside it." The queen mother stepped over the threshold stone into the toll post and drew from the inside pocket of her dark plum-purple cloak a small folded vellum letter, the seal a small dark plum-colored wax pressed with the bronze ferry-scow of the bracken line, and laid it on the trestle table beside the public toll ledger. The wax was 23 winters old and had not been broken. "She will read it, if it must be read." "It will be read, my lady," Orla said. The queen mother nodded once. The king turned and walked back across the stone-flagged floor to the threshold stone. He stopped on the inside edge. Orla stood on the outside edge now, and they stood again at the same level on the same threshold stone for 1 long, quiet breath. Then he stepped over and out, and Rune rose from the wet meadow grass and came to his left hip, and the king walked back up the 30 paces of stone-flagged path to the upper landing, and the captain followed, and the queen mother last, and the Reeve at the upper edge of the meadow watched them come and did not move. Orla stood at the inside of the threshold stone, with Iska coming back up from the wet meadow grass to her left hip and laid her right hand once on the warm crown of the wolf's head and did not say anything. And the river mist rose pale silver-gray around the toll post, and the slow, soft rush of the Norra came up under the doorway, and the warm yeast smell of the small barley crossing breads under the linen cloth on the trestle table came up to meet it, and the day went on. High noon came clean to the Norra Crossing. The sun stood straight above the river. The river folk of the 3 South Road villages, 62 souls in all, men and women and a handful of children, stood gathered on both banks of the Norra, in two long, quiet lines along the upper edges of the south landing and the upper landing, and they did not speak, and they watched. Captain Joran Arnvalt set two of his river riders at the open door of the toll post and two at the upper edge of the south landing. The polished steel of their half-helms held the high noon clean. Reeve Caldermarsk stood at the stone shelf beside the hearth with the public toll ledger open before him, his pasty cool fish-belly pale face a hand's breadth paler than at first light, the small dry chuckle gone. His pale watery blue eyes flickered side to side and never settled. King Rorik Aldredson sat on the long oak trestle bench along the south wall of the toll post. The Lady Marisol Aldredsdottir sat at his left side. Captain Joran Arnvalt sat at his right side. The bench had been built by Orla's grandmother's grandfather 240 winters ago to a single level height across its full length, and across its full length it sat the king and his mother and his captain at one single level height with no half-inch of advantage to any of the three of them, and that was the keep. Old Cosman Threshford came in through the open door with the long bundle wrapped in tarred linen across his arms and the 10th knot rope coiled twice at his belt. He did not look at the Reeve. He laid the long bundle slow and careful across the center of the trestle table along the north wall, took the 10th rope from his belt, and laid it beside the bundle, and stepped back 2 paces with his right hand lightly on his grandson Petar's left shoulder. Petar Threshford stood at his grandfather's left hip with the half-pole grounded against the floor and his pale river-gray eyes steady on Orla. Orla Riverbend came in last. She had her grandmother Isot's 18-foot ironshod ashwood pole carried at the slope on her right shoulder, the long shaft the color of dark wet honey in the warm gold. The long iron crossing key was in her left hand. The small carved willowwood fairy token her mother Bryn had carved for her on her 4th winter hung on the thin braided rivergrass cord at her throat against the dark forest green of her formal kirtle. She walked the 4 slow paces to the king's foot at the trestle bench. She bent her knee once, slow, and laid the pole flat on the floor at his foot. She laid the iron crossing key beside the pole. She lifted the cord over her head and laid the willowwood fairy token beside the key. She straightened and stepped back 2 paces. The Lady Marisol Aldredsdottir drew the small folded vellum letter from the inside pocket of her dark plum-purple cloak and laid it on the trestle table beside the long bundle of the 9 knot ropes. The dark plum-colored wax of the seal had not been broken in 23 winters. The king looked at the floor at his foot, and at the table along the north wall, and at the 4 objects laid at his foot in plain order. He did not speak. He turned his head toward the stone shelf beside the hearth. "Reeve." "Sire." The high, reedy, nasal voice came thinner than at first light. "Read the public toll ledger of the King's Crossing, the count of silver brought to the Brackenhold treasury in the 10 winters since the death of my grandfather, King Aaron, the Crossing King." The Reeve drew a breath that did not quite come full. He laid his pasty, cool, soft hand on the open page of the ledger and ran the index finger of his other hand down the right margin of the column, page by slow, careful page, his lips moving quietly to the count, the brass corners of the calfskin cover catching the noon. He came to the foot of the column. He drew breath again. 487 silver, sire, in 10 winters. A small, dry chuckle tried to come and did not. 487 silver into the Brackenhold treasury by my own hand on the public toll ledger of the Royal Ford Steward of the Norra. Sire. The king nodded once, slow, without looking at the Reeve. He turned his head to the long oak trestle table along the north wall. "Master Threshford?" "Sire." Cosman's voice was very low and very slow. "What knot count do your ropes show in the same 10 winters of the same crossing?" Cosman set his right hand once flat on the long bundle of 9 knot ropes wrapped in tarred linen. He lifted the tarred cord ties off it slow and let the linen fall open. The 9 knot ropes lay coiled in a long row across the table, each rope tied off at both ends with a small leather tag in the slow, careful brown ink hand of Cosman Threshford. The year mark of one of the 9 winters set on each tag. The 10th rope at his belt's edge of the table lay open and unrolled, its tar-stained length running half the table's length. Every knot of every silver of the present winter to this day counted in. He lifted the rope of the first winter from the row. He let the coil slip half open under his hand. He did not have to count. The river folk had counted with him on every market day for 10 winters in his willow cottage and had named the counts for him. 974 silver, sire. 974 silver paid into a Riverbend hand at the King's Crossing in the 10 winters since the death of King Aaron. Knot for knot, witness for witness. Each river folk who paid is named in tar thumb on the rope beside their own knots, and each may be called now to the toll post door if your captain will. The king turned his head to Captain Joran Arnvald. Captain, sire, call the 11 names whom Master Threshford has set ready at the upper edge of the meadow. The captain rose. He walked to the open door, stepped to the outer edge of the threshold stone, and called 11 names, low and clipped and unhurried, in the order Cosman Threshford had given him at the second bell of the morning. 11 river folk of the 3 South Road villages who had paid silver at the King's Crossing in each of the 10 winters of the forging. Each came one by one out of the line on the upper landing and stopped at the outside edge of the threshold stone. Each of the 11, in turn, named their knot on the rope beside their own thumbprint, named the silver they had paid into a Riverbend hand on the date of their crossing, and set their right hand once flat against the doorpost in the river folk way of swearing true, and stepped back and walked back to their place on the upper landing. The toll post went quiet. The Reeve at the stone shelf had gone the color of a dressed fish. His pale, watery blue eyes had stopped flickering side to side. The small, dry chuckle did not come. His right hand lay flat on the open page of the public toll ledger and trembled, the once, and went still. The king did not turn his head to the Reeve. He spoke to the Reeve from his place at the center of the long oak trestle bench. Reeve Calder Marsk, Royal Ford Steward of the Norra, where stands the 487 silver between the public ledger of your hand and the knot rope tally of Master Threshford? The Reeve drew breath. The breath did not quite come out. He drew it again. He spoke in a voice that had lost the high, reedy nasal carry and gone thin and dry and very quiet. At Marsk's Bend, sire, 2 leagues south on the Norra, into the hand of Olin Marsk, my cousin, who keeps the private downstream ferry there. For 10 winters, half a coin of every 2 coins paid at the King's Crossing, by my own hand, sire. And the river folk who could not pay the wagon rate at Marsk's Bend, for 10 winters? They did not cross at Marsk's Bend, sire. They did not cross south at all. In 9 winter months out of 12, sire. The king nodded once, slow. Captain Arnvald, sire, take Reeve Calder Marsk. The captain rose. The 2 river riders at the open door of the toll post stepped 1 pace into the room. The Reeve did not resist. The captain set his right hand once at the back of the Reeve's plum-purple collar and walked him out of the toll post, past the threshold stone and into the warm gold of the upper meadow, and the river folk of the 3 South Road villages on the upper edge of the upper landing parted in 2 slow, quiet lines for him as he was walked through, and not one of them spoke, and the small, dry chuckle did not come, and the brass-buckled belt of the plum-purple tunic went out of the toll post and out of the keep right of the Norra Crossing and did not return. The king rose from the long oak trestle bench. He bent and lifted the 18-foot ironshod ashwood pole from the floor at his foot and laid it back across his right palm, and he bent again and lifted the long iron crossing key and the small carved willowwood ferry token from the floor and held them in his left hand. And he walked the 4 slow paces from the bench to where Orla stood at the center of the room. He laid the pole back into her right hand and the key and the small ferry token back into her left hand, and he closed her hands once with his own. Mistress Riverbend? Sire, bring me your second pole, the one of your apprentice. I have a crossing to make. Orla looked once at Peter Threshford. Petter's pale river-gray eyes went bright. He stepped forward and laid the small, iron-shod half-pole into the king's right hand without one word. The king lifted it once at the center to feel the balance of it and set it across his shoulder. He walked out of the toll post past the threshold stone. The Lady Marisol rose and came after him. Cosman and Pitar came after. The river folk on the upper landing parted as the king came down the path with the half-pole at his shoulder and Rune at his left hip, and Orla came after him with her grandmother's pole at her shoulder and Iska at her left hip, and the captain came up out of the meadow at the queen mother's left elbow, and the river folk on both banks stood very still and watched. At the upper landing, the king set the half-pole down across the bow rail of the scow. He turned to Orla. Mistress, sire. He drew a single bright silver from the small leather purse at his belt and laid it flat in the palm of her right hand and folded her fingers closed on it. For yesterday's crossing, mistress, of my mother and my captain and my 8 riders and me, the silver of the king's first crossing of the Norra under the keep right of his line, paid into the hand of the ferry keeper, as is the keep, hand to hand, no man between. As my grandfather King Aaron paid your grandmother Orla Riverbend in the flood winter. Yes, sire. He stepped down off the upper landing onto the scow. Rune walked at his left hip and lay down at the bow. The Queen Mother stepped down after the king and stood at the bow rail and laid her right hand once on the warm tarred wood and stood very still. The captain stepped down after the Queen Mother and stood at the center of the scow with his hands at his belt. Petter Threshford stepped down to the windlass crank with both hands ready. Orla stepped down last. She walked the length of the scow to the stern with her grandmother's 18-foot pole at her right shoulder, and she set the iron pole shoe down on the planks at her right boot, and she laid her right hand on the warm tarred wood, and she laid her left hand on the rail, and she looked once at Iska on the upper landing, where Iska had laid herself a pole-length back from the stone of the landing, and Iska's flat ears were lifted now, and Iska's warm golden amber eyes were on her, and Iska did not move. The king lifted the half-pole from the bow-rail and stood at the bow. Petter slid the locking pawl out of the windlass crank and turned the crank one-handed, slow and steady, the chain coming clean up out of the river through the rear bollard and going down again, clean through the front bollard, and the scow began to move along the chain southward into the water. The slow, soft rush of the slow current parted at the bow. The river mist had been gone since the first hour of morning. The high noon stood still above them. The pale gray-green of the slow water passed slow under the planks. Halfway across, the king set the half-pole down across his right shoulder and stood at the bow rail and looked once down the river toward the bend at Marsk's Bend, 2 leagues south, and once upriver toward the willow cottage at Threshford, half a league above the toll post. He did not turn his head to Orla at the stern. He spoke into the slow air above the slow water. He came across this ferry once, my grandfather Aaron, in the flood winter of his 17th year, and your grandmother, Orla Riverbend, poled him across when no other ferry keeper on the Norra would set out. I have not stood on the south bank of this river until today. I cross it now for him. Orla said nothing. Her right hand was steady on the warm tarred wood of her grandmother's pole. Her left hand was steady on the rail. The scow came in to the south landing. The king set the half-pole back across his shoulder and stepped down off the bow onto the river stone of the south landing alone. He walked the 4 slow paces of the south landing's upper edge and stopped and turned. He stood on the south bank of the Norra and looked back across the slow gray-green water at the upper landing on the north bank, and at the toll post above the upper landing, and at the upstream willow scrub and the small gray shape of Cosman Threshford's willow cottage half a league above, and at the long line of birch-wood that climbed away beyond the meadow toward Brackenhold. The high noon stood very still above the river. He did not move for the length of 7 slow breaths. Then he turned and walked the 4 slow paces back, and stepped down off the south landing stone onto the planks of the scow, and walked the slow length of the scow to the stern where Orla stood. He drew a second bright silver from the small leather purse at his belt and laid it flat on top of the first in the palm of her right hand and folded her fingers closed on it again. For this crossing, mistress, hand to hand, no man between. Orla closed her hand on the 2 silvers. She did not speak. He walked back to the bow. Petter slid the locking pawl out of the windlass crank again and turned it one-handed, slow and steady, and the scow began to move along the chain northward, back across the slow, soft rush of the slow water. Iska on the upper landing on the north bank rose from her place a pole-length back from the stone and stood at the upper edge of the landing and watched the scow come on. The river folk on the upper edges of the 2 landings of the Norra Crossing stood very still and watched. No one spoke. The scow came into the upper landing. Petter locked the windlass crank into its pawl. The king set the half-pole down across the bow rail. He stepped off onto the river stone of the upper landing, and Rune walked at his left hip, and the Queen Mother stepped off after him with the captain's right hand at her elbow this time, and Orla stepped off last with her grandmother's 18-foot pole at her right shoulder. She walked up the stone-flagged path with the king at her left side, the Queen Mother and captain a pace behind, Iska at her left hip and Rune at the king's, and Cosman and Petar, and the 4 river folk who had been named first came up the path behind. The rest of the river folk on both banks did not yet break the lines. In the toll post, the Queen Mother went to the hearth and lifted the linen cloth from the small flat barley crossing, breads Orla had set on the warm hearthstone at the second bell. There were 10 of them, baked clean and warm and round. She set them in a slow, careful row along the center of the trestle bench against the south wall. The king sat at the center of the bench. The queen mother sat at his left side. The captain sat at his right side. Cosman Threshford sat at the queen mother's left side. Peter Threshford sat at Cosman's left side. The 4 river folk who had been named first at the door sat in slow, careful order along the rest of the bench at the captain's right side. They sat all at the same single level height across the bench, calm and steady, no half-inch of advantage to any of the 10 of them. Orla stood at the center of the room with her right hand on the warm wood of the table and watched, and she did not sit because she had set out the bread. The king took up the small, flat barley crossing bread set before him on the bench and held it in both hands a moment and looked at it. He ate it slow, one bite at a time, the way Orla's grandmother Iseult had told her grandson once that the king's grandfather had eaten the same small, flat barley crossing bread on the flood winter day, sitting at the same long oak trestle bench 73 winters ago, and a little more, in his 17th year, before he was crowned, and the old woman who had baked it for him had been Orla's grandmother's mother. The bench at one single level height, the bread small in his hand, the river going slow past the open door behind him. Iska lay at Orla's left foot. Rune lay at the king's right foot. The high noon turned slow toward the afternoon above the Norra. The afternoon turned slow toward sunset over the Norra Crossing. The river folk of the 3 South Road villages had broken from their long, quiet lines an hour past the eating of the bread, and had come up to the toll post door in slow, careful order, and each had laid one small white river stone, in turn, on the stone-flagged path beside the door, 62 stones in all, in the river folk way of marking a true keep, and had walked back across the upper landing and the south landing to their roads home. Captain Joran Arnvald had ridden at second bell of the afternoon, north up the meadow path, through the low birch-wood toward Brackenhold, with a single rider behind him, and Reeve Calder Marsk between them on the slow grey gelding, with his hands tied at the wrists with a tarred cord rope, the public toll ledger of the red-stained calfskin under the captain's left arm. The 8 river riders of the King's Column had taken the wagons and the pack mules across on the second crossing of the afternoon, and had set camp on the upper meadow above the toll post, a half bowshot back from the river edge in the old camp place that had been used by the Bracken line on the flood winter day 73 winters ago. The smoke of their hearth fires rose slow and pale into the warm gold of the late afternoon. The toll post hearth had been banked low. The small open hearth in the center of the stone-flagged room held a steady warm bed of soft gray ash with a dark red heart at the center. The long oak trestle table along the north wall held the long bundle of the 9 knot ropes wrapped again in tarred linen and the 10th at its end of the table. Beside the bundle sat the public toll ledger that had been brought back to the toll post by Cosman Threshford from the upper meadow at the second bell, and the small folded vellum letter of King Aaron the Crossing King beside the ledger, the dark plum-colored wax seal still unbroken on the letter. The Lady Marisol Aldred's daughter stood at the open door of the toll post with her dark plum-purple riding cloak straight at her shoulders, looking out at the slow, soft, pale gold-and-silver light on the slow water. She did not speak. King Rorik Aldredson sat at the center of the long oak trestle bench along the south wall. Old Cosman Threshford sat at the Queen Mother's place at the king's left side. Peter Threshford sat at his grandfather's left side. Orla Riverbend stood at the center of the stone-flagged room with her right hand on the warm wood of the trestle table where the bundle and the ledger and the letter lay. Iska lay at her left foot. Rune lay at the king's right foot. The 2 wolves did not move. The king turned his head to Orla. "Mistress Riverbend," his voice was very low, "I will name what is to be done. Sire, at first light tomorrow, at this trestle table in the warm gold of the morning, I will sign the Bracken line writ for the Norra Crossing in my own hand, in slow, careful brown ink, and I will stamp it with the bronze ferry-scow of my line. The writ will name the keep right of the Norra Crossing in perpetuity to the Riverbend line, mother to daughter, and the line will not be broken in any winter to come, in any famine, in any flood, in any council by any reeve or warden or clerk. The writ will be sealed at the foot by my mother and witnessed at the foot by Captain Arnvald on his return. Yes, sire. The king's silver of every market day will be paid into your hand, mistress, by my own under-treasurer, riding down out of Brackenhold at first light, hand to hand. No man between. The office of Royal Ford Steward of the Norra is dissolved by the writ at first light tomorrow. There will be no Ford Reeve between the throne and the ferry keeper in this winter or in any winter to come. The Bracken line will keep its grandfather's charge. Yes, sire. The private ferry at Marsk's Bend is shut. The Marsk line is stripped of the cousin grant of the Royal Ford Steward and of the keep fee at Marsk's Bend. The downstream landing reverts to the river folk of the South Road villages as a free village ford in dry summer and is closed in any other season. Yes, sire. Master Threshford? Sire. Cosman's voice was low and slow. Your 9 knot ropes and your 10th at your belt will go north with my under-treasurer to the Royal Archive at Brackenhold. They will be copied into the Master Register of the Kingdom in the slow, careful brown ink hand of my own clerk. They will be set in the archive beside the writ of King Hallen I, 240 winters old, that names the Riverbend line to the keep right of this crossing. The river folk who set their thumbprints in tar soot beside their own knots will be named in the Master Register. The leather-bound private tally book of your retired hand will be set in the archive beside the ropes. Sire! Cosman nodded once, slow. Peter Threshford? Sire. Peter's voice broke a little on the word. You will be named, at the foot of the writ, at first light tomorrow, as apprentice of the King's Crossing under the keep right of Mistress Orla Riverbend. You will keep the half-pole of your grandfather's gift, and you will hold the chain windlass, and you will stand at the bow on every crossing she will lend you the bow on. And on the day Mistress Riverbend has a daughter, and that daughter is of pole age, you will stand aside for the daughter as is the keep, and on no other day. Do you take the apprentice keep, Peter? I take it, sire. Good. The king rose from the center of the long oak trestle bench. He stood at the center of the room before Orla, at the same single-level height, with her on the level stone-flagged floor, no half-inch of advantage on either side. He raised his right hand to the cuff of his dark gray wool tunic and drew the thin braided rivergrass cord out from under the cuff and slipped it loose from his right wrist and held the small plain copper crossing token of King Aaron the Crossing King in his right hand against the low warm light from the banked hearth. He laid the token in Orla's right hand and folded her fingers closed on it once with his own. He carried it from the flood winter of his 17th year to his deathbed at 76 winters mistress. Your grandmother, Esot Riverbend, laid it back in his hand at the south landing of this crossing, because the crossing was true and the token was his. He laid it in my hand on the night he died, when I was 8 winters old, with 3 charges that were the keep right of his line. I have carried it for 23 winters at my right wrist on this thin braided rivergrass cord. I lay it now in your hand. He drew a single slow breath. The line that crossed him is your line, mistress. The keep is your keep. Wear it at the toll post on a new rivergrass cord at your throat, beside your mother Bryn's small carved willowwood ferry token, and let King Aaron's crossing token stay at the King's Crossing, where it was given. He has been welcome at this crossing for 73 winters. He will be welcome at this crossing for the rest of the keep. Orla closed her hand on the small plain copper crossing token. The copper was warm from his wrist. She felt the thin braided rivergrass cord still on the loop at her thumb. She lifted her left hand and laid it once over her closed right hand, the way her mother had laid her own left hand once over a thing of weight given. He is welcome at this crossing, sire. He always was. The king nodded once, slow. The Lady Marisol at the open door turned her head and looked at the two of them and lifted the corner of her mouth a hand's breadth and let it fall. Cosman Threshford on the long oak trestle bench laid his right hand once on the warm crown of his grandson's head. Iska at Orla's left foot lifted her warm earth-brown muzzle once toward Orla's closed hand and lowered it again. Rune at the king's right foot did not move. The slow, soft, pale gold and silver light went down off the water. The toll-post hearth held its dark red heart at the center of the soft gray ash. The Norra Crossing closed for the night. First light came clean to the Norra Crossing. The river mist lay long and low and pale silver gray across the slow water of the Norra and across the meadow of pale rivergrass between the toll-post and the upper landing, and the first gray light of the morning was just touching the underside of the mist from the east. Orla Riverbend stood at the south anchor stone with the long iron crossing key in her right hand, and she fitted it into the keyhole of the chain lock and turned it once to the right. The bolt of the lock slid back with the small, clean iron clack that her grandmother and her mother had made before her. The chain settled a half-hand's breadth into the water as the night tension came off. The crossing was open. She walked back up the stone-flagged path to the toll post and banked the morning fire and set the day's small flat barley crossing breads on the warm hearthstone with the wooden bread paddle. The warm yeast smell rose into the room. The king was already at the long oak trestle table along the north wall of the toll post. He had come down from the upper meadow camp at Ferry-Bell with the Lady Marisol at his left side and Captain Joran Arnvalt at the door, and Rune at his left hip, and a long pale gray vellum sheet rolled and tied with a thin dark blue cord in his right hand. He had set the vellum across the center of the trestle table and unrolled it, and now stood at the table with his small inkhorn from his belt open beside the vellum, and a fresh quill cut clean by his own hand laid beside the inkhorn, and the bronze ferry-scow seal of the bracken line set ready at the foot of the vellum. The Queen Mother stood at his left elbow. The captain stood at the open door. Cosman Threshford and Peter Threshford stood at the far side of the trestle table at level height with the king. Orla came up to the trestle table at the king's right elbow and laid her hands flat on the warm wood and stood at level height with him. Iska lay at her left foot. Rune lay at the king's right foot. The king dipped the quill in the small inkhorn. He wrote the bracken line Writ for the Norra Crossing in his own hand in slow, careful brown ink across the long, pale gray vellum, line by line, the keep right of the crossing in perpetuity to the Riverbend line, mother to daughter. The king's silver paid every market day directly into the ferry keeper's hand by the under-treasurer of Brackenhold, hand to hand, no man between. The office of Royal Ford Steward of the Norra dissolved by the Writ. The private ferry at Marsk's Bend shut and the Marsk line stripped of the cousin Grant. Peter Threshford named apprentice of the King's Crossing under the keep right of Mistress Orla Riverbend. Cosman Threshford's 9 knot ropes and his retired private tally book set into the Royal Archive at Brackenhold beside the writ of King Hallan I. He signed the writ at the foot in his own hand, Rorik Aldredson of the Bracken line, the 27th of his line in the 4th winter of his reign. He stamped the bronze ferry-scow seal at the foot. He stood. He rolled the writ slow and careful in a single long roll and tied it with a fresh, thin, dark blue cord, and he laid it in Orla's hands. Mistress Riverbend, sire, the keep right is yours, in perpetuity, mother to daughter, in the bracken line writ of King Rorik Aldredson of Brackenhold. Set the writ in the small private cupboard built into the north wall of the toll post, beside the writ of King Hallan I, and turn the chain key in the cupboard lock as is the keep. Yes, sire, he turned to Peter Threshford. Sire. The king drew from the dark leather sheath at his left hip a small steel ferry knife, the length of a man's hand, the blade narrow and clean, the haft of plain dark wood, bound in tarred cord. He laid it in Peter's right hand. It was the apprentice knife of my grandfather King Aaron, on the day he was named the apprentice of the throne in his 14th winter. Wear it at your belt at the King's Crossing under the keep right of Mistress Riverbend, and set it down for your own son or grandson on the day he is named at this trestle table. You are apprentice Petter? Sire. Petter's voice broke a little. He closed his right hand on the haft. The king turned to Cosman. Master Threshford? Sire. The king lifted from the floor at the foot of the trestle table a long leather satchel of fine dark river leather, plain cut, tarred at the seams. He set it across the trestle table. The bundle of the 9 knot ropes and the 10th and the leather-bound private tally book will go north with my under-treasurer at second bell. The river folk who set their thumbprints on the ropes will be named in the master register of the kingdom. The satchel returns to your willow cottage with my under-treasurer at the next market day, with the master register's copy at the foot, sealed by my own clerk. Sire. Cosman nodded once, slow. The king turned at last to Orla. He drew a single bright silver from the small leather purse at his belt and laid it flat in the palm of her right hand and folded her fingers closed on it. For the morning's crossing of the king's column, back across the Norra to Brackenhold, mistress, hand to hand, as is the keep. Yes, sire, he turned. The Queen Mother turned with him. The captain stood from the open door. Rune rose from the king's right foot and walked at his left hip. The king walked out of the toll post past the threshold stone into the warm gold of the first light. He did not turn. He did not look back. His tall straight back went up the stone-flagged path in the river mist toward the upper landing. The Lady Marisol, Aldred's daughter, walked 4 paces behind the king on the stone-flagged path, and at the upper edge of the upper landing she stopped and she turned her head and she lifted her gloved right hand once toward the open door of the toll post. Orla stood in the open door with the rolled writ in her left hand and the silver in her right. She lifted her free left hand once in answer. The Queen Mother let her hand fall and turned and walked on. The king's column took the second crossing of the morning across the slow gray green of the Norra under Orla's grandmother's 18-foot pole at the stern, and Peter Threshford's small steel ferry knife at his belt and the chain windlass turning slow and steady. At the South Landing, the column gathered, and the wagons and the pack mules came across at the third crossing, and at second bell, the king took his tall, dark bay stallion at the upper edge of the South Landing and rode south at the head of his column down the South Road across the marsh on the raised stone causeway. He did not turn his head. The Lady Marisol turned her head once at the long bend of the South Road a half bow shot from the South Landing and lifted her gloved hand once more. And Orla on the upper landing of the north bank lifted her free left hand once more in answer, and the Queen Mother let her hand fall, and the column rode on into the warm gold of the first morning, and the dark forest green, and the dark plum-purple and the bronze ferry-scow pin went small and small along the South Road and were gone into the marshlight. Iska sat at the upper edge of the upper landing and watched them go. Orla walked back down the stone-flagged path to the toll post. She set the rolled writ in the small private cupboard built into the north wall, beside the dark old vellum of the writ of King Hallan I, and turned the chain key in the cupboard lock once, and the bolt slid into place. She set the silver in the small wooden coin box on the stone shelf. She went to the trestle table along the north wall and untied the small, thin, braided rivergrass cord from the loop at her thumb where she had carried it through the morning. She lifted her mother Bryn's small carved willowwood fairy token out from under the dark forest green of her formal kirtle. She slipped the small plain copper crossing token of King Aaron the Crossing King onto the new rivergrass cord beside the willowwood fairy token and tied the cord off at her throat. The two tokens lay against her sternum, the plain copper of the king's grandfather and the small carved willowwood of her own mother, side by side. She walked back down the stone-flagged path to the upper landing. She set her right hand on the warm tarred wood of her grandmother's pole standing in the pole clamp at the north end of the scow. She set her left hand on the iron ratchet windlass. She turned the crank, slow and steady, for the day's first crossing south. The Norra ran on,